Hi, Misha here, and today I'm going to look at the underappreciated Aardvark, the General Dynamics F-111, and this is the C model as used by the Aussies. And I'm probably not going to move this one so much because the stand is rather tall and precarious. I think I may have to end up kind of gluing the top bit of the stand onto the stem. We'll see. And I said underappreciated. And I will confess, I am guilty. Not only did I not think much about the F-111, I wasn't even going to get a model of it. It just seemed like kind of an insignificant, not fail, but just, one of the many. But in reality, it actually has a very interesting history. Well, the F-111 dates back to the Tactical Fighter Experimental Project, TFX, which itself dates back to 1960. At that time, the Air Force needed a new long-range strike fighter bomber. Basically something to come in low and fast and deliver a payload. Not unlike the F-105 Thunder Chief, but more on the strategic level, less on the tactical level. And something with a little more range and flight time. And around the same time, the U.S. Navy thought it needed a new long-range interdictor interceptor aircraft that could stay on station, patrol the fleet, defend the fleet, go for long distances, having long-range missiles, larger missiles. Again, somewhat like the F-4 Phantom, which they had just adopted, but more of a strategic fighter than a tactical, bigger, badder, with more heavy weapons versus the smaller missiles of the F-4. So they both had this need, and it was relatively similar. Well, 1961, the Kennedy White House is coming in, and Robert McNamara has all these new ideas. And he basically wants the Air Force and the Navy to combine their efforts and adopt one plane with two variations to fill both needs. And he more or less makes this in order, even though there is a lot of resistance. The Air Force and the Navy cannot agree on a whole lot. They both agree it should be a two-engine, two-seat plane. They also both like the idea of having variable geometry wings, swept wings, which is new technology at the time. But that's about it. Otherwise, they have very different needs. Nevertheless, it's in order. October of that year, the government makes its needs known, And in December of 61, many companies come back with ideas and design plans. Many, but typical names: Lockheed, Republic, North American, and Boeing, and General Dynamics. Of those, really none of them were acceptable to either the Navy or the Air Force, but the best of the worst were the General Dynamics and the Boeing designs. So they were both requested to submit more fleshed out, more complete designs. And what came back, the Air Force was mostly happy with the Boeing, except they didn't like the engines. Okay, engines could be changed. The Navy wasn't happy with either one. Throughout 1962, committees, boards routinely picked the Boeing TFX submission. But McNamara again steps in, and in November of that year pushes through the General Dynamics. And his reasoning was that the Navy and the Air Force versions use many more common or the same parts versus the Boeing design, which had relatively few components in common. Congress and others protested, but it was a done deal. So by 63, General Dynamics has a mock-up, and this would be for the F-111A, which was the Air Force's plane, and the F-111B would be the Navy variation. And basically they started off making a plane for the Air Force, and then they were going to modify it to suit the Navy's carrier needs. Well, the Air Force plane was ready in September, October of 64. It took its first flight. But for the Navy's version, General Dynamics needed help. It had never designed a carrier aircraft, so it turned to Grumman, who had a long history of working with the Navy and their aircraft carriers. And so they pitched in, and in May of 65, the F-111B prototype first flew. Then, in 1967, the first production F-111As were sent to the Air Force. However, the following year, 68, the Navy canceled the F-111B. It cited that the plane was overweight, so it was basically fat shaming, and also that it had severe performance issues. Keep in mind now, obviously the Kennedy administration is long gone, so McNamara is no longer there to champion this idea. So the B is gone, so this is just an Air Force plane. What do we have? Well, it's a long plane at over 73 feet, one of the longest we have. With the wings fully out, we're over 60 feet, I believe around 62, 63. With them folded in, we're at 32. The variable geometry wings, or the sweep wings, have a lot of advantages. One of the requirements that the Air Force had, this plane had to operate from short and/or primitive, uncleaned up, crappy runways, airfields. Well, for takeoff, you could spread the wings, and you see very wide. And then in flight, you could partially fold them in to, a 45-degree angle or so. And for diving and striking, You could fold them in all the way to about 16 degrees. This would give it a good dive, a good speed. It would also make it a smaller target. And then, of course, for landing again, you could fully sweep them back out to about 72 degrees. So it allowed for high performance off a short runway, essentially, amongst other things. And this was the first production military swept-wing jet. It was also the first jet to have automatic terrain-following radar. It has 2 crew members, and they sit together, side by side, instead of in tandem. This was actually originally made per Navy's requirements because they wanted the 2 pilots to use the same instrumentation to save on that. Also, the Navy wanted not ejection seats but an ejection capsule. So, in the event of the plane getting shot down, the entire cockpit would jettison out with the 2 crew members safely inside. Even though the Navy ended up not going with this plane, that feature was maintained. It is also still a 2-engine plane. And it could really cook speed-wise. It could get up to Mach 2.5, so faster than either the F-106A Delta Dart or the F-4 Phantom. It could also get way up there to 66,000 feet. But again, it was meant to come in fast and low because when this was first created, SAM sites at the time and the radars that they used had a harder time hitting lower flying aircraft than they did high. It has an internal weapons bay as well as multiple external hardpoints, and it can carry quite a large bomb or missile load. Interestingly, 2 of the pylons, 1 on each wing, rotate as the wings do, something that later would be dropped on other swing-wing aircraft because it was just very convoluted. But for a time, this and a few other planes used it, for example, the British Tornado. And so this did have a lot of advancements for its day and time. It really was a very advanced aircraft for 1967, 1968 when it first started to be used. And with advancements, as we know from the Century series, come problems. Thought I would fold the wings up for you. It's really unstable on the stand with all the weight in the back like this, so when I display it I always have the wings out. Anyway, in March of '68, the Air Force would send 6 F-111s over to Vietnam to get some real-world combat feedback, and promptly 3 of them fell out of the sky. At first, no one knew exactly what happened, if it was enemy fire or what, but it was soon discovered that it was actually a faulty stabilizer, therefore a design flaw. So they had to go back and fix this, yada yada yada. Long story short, these were still in development up until '71, and then at which time they pretty much declared them fully functional, fully operational, and ready to go. As a result, in September of '72, F-111s were sent back over to Vietnam. They took place in Operation Linebacker. And finally, they started to prove themselves. This big jet, very advanced, actually started to show that it had some assets. For one, its terrain-following radar and other advanced electronic systems allowed it to fly in virtually any weather, any condition. So these could go up even when other airplanes could not. And in like East Asia, where you have a rainy season, a monsoon season, that's not insignificant. So these could pretty much fly. They were a true all-weather fighter. For another, they could carry about 4 times the ordnance, 4 times the bomb load of, say, an F-4 Phantom. So, one plane can carry the same as 4. For another, because of their size and fuel capacity, they did not need aerial refueling like, say, an F-105 Thunder Chief. They could go there and back or stay on station much longer. So it was a big, long-ranged, all-weather, heavy-hitting plane. And it was also very fast. It could go quite high. And again, the variable geometry wings give it a lot of flexibility for taking off and landing. It was still a complicated aircraft, and it never ended up being all that great. It had a lot of maintenance for every flight hour. It required more than that to keep running on the ground. But nevertheless, these were fully functional and used by America and East Asia through the 70s. And when production ended in 1976, General Dynamics had turned out over 560. Not a huge number, but not bad. The only major foreign user was the Royal Australian Air Force, who in 1967 agreed to purchase 24 F-111s, and they would make a version called the F-111C, customized for their needs. Unfortunately, again, because of all the issues that cropped up during testing, they did not start to really be delivered to Australia until 1973. But once they did, they actually were very well liked. The original 24 ordered were delivered in batches of 6. And then also in 1982, another 4 were delivered. What basically they did, they took early F-111As from the U.S. Air Force that were no longer needed. They refurbished them and updated them to 11Cs and were sent over to Australia. So a total of 28, give or take. The next time these would really be used, to note, was on airstrikes in Libya in 1986. Operation Grand Canyon, in which 18 F-111s were sent on missions. In fact, they did the longest single fighter aircraft mission, which was 13 hours. And they had a good success rate. They delivered their ordnance with only 1 aircraft being lost. No one knows for sure exactly what happened. It's theorized that a SAM site shot her down. It's also worth saying, going back, once these were sent to Vietnam, even though they weren't on theater all that much, they did fly over 4,000 times, and only 6 aircraft were lost to the enemy in Vietnam. So once they got going, they were actually pretty good. Again, these are still much in service in 1990, and then in 91, when Operation Desert Storm, the first Gulf War, 66 F-111s were used then, and they were used as the Air Force's primary strike fighter aircraft, delivering a large number of ordnance. They were also used to destroy Iraqi tanks and other armored craft on the ground, using laser-guided ammunitions. And they were credited with destroying at least 1,500 Iraqi tanks. So quite useful. And that was pretty much it. In 1996, the Air Force would retire the fighter-bomber version here. And actually, it's at that time that this was officially designated the Aardvark. That was always kind of the unofficial name or the nickname because of its nose and all that and how it looks. The Aussies would call it the pig. But it was officially named the Aardvark in 96 when it was being retired. Now, that was the fighter version. The electronic warfare version, known as the Raven, lasted a couple of years longer, being phased out in 1998. And that was the end of its service in the U.S. Air Force. Maybe not the best career ever, but it did its job eventually. And it did it well. And it was actually a pretty safe aircraft. You know, its safety record, once the kinks were worked out, was quite high. Also, I think the little capsule thing is neat. In Australia, this would soldier on. It never was used in combat, but it was a great deterrent in Southeast Asia. It was one of the most advanced fighter jets in theater in its day. They would keep their planes running for a long time. They would start to retire some in 2007, replacing them with FA-18 Super Hornets, which would be the FA-18E and F, which really was just supposed to be a stopgap measure until the F-35 Lightning was ready, but that's a whole other kettle of fish. The last Aussie, F-111C, was retired out in December of 2010. And that's pretty much it. All the planes in the world today have been retired and they're no longer flying. It's a neat design, and it really led the way. For example, you know, the Tomcat uses the swing wing. The TFX program really inspired Russia to develop the MiG-23, the Sukhoi 24, Su-24, and the MiG-25, which in turn inspired the U.S. to make the F-15 Eagle, so on and so forth, which of course then inspired Russia to make the MiG-29. Anyway, so it was kind of at the beginning of this fighter arms race, and so had a lot of advanced stuff, so it's really no wonder that it had teething issues. The Eagle, the Hobbymaster model here is very well built. It's very chunky, very heavy, mostly metal. The wings are good. They're not floppy. They fold and unfold easily, but they're stiff. The ordnance, though, is just a large peg. That way you can rotate it. One of mine's okay, but the other one's really loose. I'm going to have to figure out what to do, because you can't glue it in, because then you can't rotate it, but you got to get something in there. So I may try to fill the hole in, maybe with some putty, or maybe build up a little bit more with a bit of glue on the stud, just to, I don't know, I'll have to figure it out. So I think they could have done that better. The wings are good. What I think I would have done for those, either make them just permanently part of the model so you can just make them a hinge, or maybe come from the top and put a small stud or screw to screw them in so they rotate freely but also not fall off. I don't know. It seems like they could have done a little better there. But, it's kind of a hard task, I know. Another thing is the stand. That top piece just really wants to come off because of the weight and the fact that when you have the wings swept back, it really puts it all in the back there. That's why I'm not rotating it. I just don't want to tempt fate. Forward, the wings, it's a lot more stable. But back, it's just too heavy in the back. So that's kind of a complaint I have about a lot of the Hobbymaster stands. They really should, again, maybe screw or bolt. Have kind of like Air Force One does with the thumb screw. But they need to do something. At least make them out of all metal. They've started making the stems out of metal on the heavier planes, but the base and the top piece are still plastic. Still a cool model, and it's not like many people do the F-111. They do this Aussie version. They've done an Air Force version, and they're just coming out with this summer the electronic version, the Raven, the EA F-111. Cool nonetheless. Alrighty guys, it's late and I'm tired, so I'm going to call it a day. Any questions or comments, post them below. This is Misha, and I'll catch you next time.